So Starfield came out about a year ago, and a lot of people are waiting to see if this game can make a comeback. It's not that it was this complete and utter flop. Like, it still sold well enough, and a lot of people play the game. But there's this general sentiment that Starfield, as far as Bethesda single-player games go, it's among the more underwhelming ones that they have made. The idea of a sci-fi, sort of space-themed Bethesda game seemed cool at first until people realized how that diminished the traditional exploration of Bethesda games, where it felt like one cohesive, unified world instead of a world that was split into a bunch of pieces and then spread out across planets that you have to fast travel to, so there's just a lot of loading times in between. And with how much space they had to fill because they had all of these planets, and the world was now not just a world, but a whole freaking galaxy, there was a lot of procedural generation, so a lot of less handcrafted stuff, or at least the handcrafted stuff was so much more dispersed and kind of diluted by the procedurally generated stuff. And people, I think, began to kind of get a sense of how Bethesda's kind of game design is starting to become outdated. What Bethesda did before, in terms of how they've really revolutionized or kind of set the standard for open world games, now other studios have come out and done better, and Bethesda's falling behind on that front. And so a lot of people are waiting to see if Shattered Space would start to show some signs of hope that maybe this game can course correct and bring people back to the idea that Bethesda can maybe start keeping up with some of these other more compelling open world experiences. But Shattered Space, the expansion for the first expansion for Starfield, it currently hasn't gone down super well. The reception surrounding it has been fairly lukewarm. First of all, critically speaking, if we look at Steam reviews, you can see that users are rating it mostly negative. It's just got a 30% review score from over 2,300 reviews. The amount of reviews are currently fairly small. It's not as big as you might think for a major DLC for a major Bethesda game. And so that already shows signs that, I mean, people who play it are not super digging it, and then a lot of people actually aren't really even buying this DLC. They've kind of tapped out, and given the reception surrounding it hasn't been amazing, it seems as though people who are waiting or who are on the fence are saying, okay, so, you know, I wasn't super into Starfield before. This is not going to be the thing that brings me back, so I'm going to skip it. But it's not just Steam players who feel this way about the DLC, about just the lukewarm nature of it overall. Despite some cool elements that they showed off during marketing, ultimately, this is a DLC that is currently sitting at a 58 Metascore from 13 critic reviews. The user score here is fairly close to that, so a lot of people agree with the overall critical reception. And there's just this element of like, this is just more Starfield, and it doesn't really push the boundaries forward much. It introduces some new elements that are not utilized as much as they should, but overall, they don't add enough content. The campaign is relatively short. The story is fine, but it doesn't really do enough to make up for all the areas where this DLC is lacking content-wise, and it just... Among the big single-player DLCs that Bethesda has made, there's this general sentiment that Shattered Space is actually among the more underwhelming ones. Despite some of the amazing vistas that this game provides, some of the aesthetic elements that are really cool, it really just doesn't add enough or overhaul the game enough. It's certainly no Phantom Liberty, what that was to Cyberpunk 2077, where it really felt chonky. And we're looking at a DLC for Starfield that is $30. The price point just doesn't feel justified based on the kind of relatively shorter campaign, based on some of the technical issues that people have encountered, and based on just a lack of substantial additional content and compelling design for just the exploration and certain quests and dungeons that should have felt maybe a little less of the typical kind of boring affair that has made the reception what it is now. And so if we look at how many people are actually engaging with Starfield now post DLC launch, you can see that while these numbers are certainly not bad, especially for a single-player game, it pales in comparison to results we've seen from past Bethesda games, and it pales in comparison to other games whose DLCs have caused a massive influx of players. So right here we have a 24-hour peak of 18,762 players as of today, but you'll see that the most we saw from the Shattered Space DLC launch on Steam was a peak of over almost 22,000 players, 21,792 players to be specific. That is an uptick of roughly 10,000, 6,000 to 10,000 players from the months prior. Which is, it's certainly more players, but not by like a significant amount, at least what you'd expect the influx to be for a game of this kind. So to give you some context, Cyberpunk 2077, when the DLC for that launched, when Phantom Liberty launched for that game, the influx was tremendous. So you can see right here that Cyberpunk 2077 dipped into sort of the 30,000-ish players, and then as soon as the DLC came out, the peaks went as high as 274,526 players. It also helped that, cross-media stuff like the Cyberpunk anime, that all of that kind of came together to create this massive influx of interest for the IP, but ultimately it also helped that Phantom Liberty was just deemed to be a really good DLC that felt chunky and substantial in its content, whose price point felt justified. It's worth noting that Phantom Liberty's price point was also $30, but it felt like it had far more. You got so much more bang for your buck with Phantom Liberty in terms of what it did for the game as a whole, including the base game and all of the free updates that came out for that leading up to Phantom Liberty, combined with how substantial that campaign and all of the side missions felt. And and obviously it took a lot more time with Phantom Liberty, but maybe Bethesda should have done the same for Shattered Space to really give this strong impression that there is hope for a comeback on the horizon. A lot of people, I think, were looking towards the first DLC to see what the direction of Starfield would be like. And it feels like so far Starfield is like, it's not a failure, but it's just the reception surrounding it is so lukewarm compared to what you'd expect for a Bethesda game that by Bethesda standards, it feels like it just fell short. And it feels like it's an experiment that ultimately failed. Like they went for this new IP, but the format of space exploration that they went with and how that ruined the open world exploration that they're known for, because everything's so fragmented now and divided by loading screens, that I think especially really negatively impacted the experience. Now, with Shattered Space, they tried to course correct. Shattered Space takes place in just one planet with one big map and area. It's more of like a traditional Bethesda-style open world. But the problem is that it is still among the less compelling new areas that they've added to a game through DLC, because the exploration just isn't rewarding in terms of what you find in the amount of content that they've added to the game. Not to say it's all bad. There are a few compelling quests here and there, and you do get a full-fledged campaign, but it feels more like a faction quest that should have been in the base game is, I think, one way to put it, maybe, instead of it feeling like a chunky expansion. And so, yeah, the player base of Starfield didn't grow substantially, which means a lot of people probably didn't buy this DLC, which doesn't bode well for future support for Starfield. Like, it's possible that Bethesda might wind down on Starfield expansions because they might look at results for Shattered Space and see that financially it's just not viable to keep investing in the game, or at least not as much as they'd like. So they might just move on and onto Elder Scrolls 6, which is their next big major project. And then that is further reinforced by the fact that if you look at the most played games on Xbox and the like, so right here, most played games on Xbox from the Microsoft official website, you can see that despite the launch of the DLC, Starfield is still all the way down here. It is 26th place in terms of most played games on Xbox, and it is beaten out by titles like these. A lot of GTA 5 still up there, Red Dead Redemption 2 still up there because, of course, Rockstar. But these are games like Starfield should at the very least top the charts for a brief moment before it starts coming down with the launch of a new DLC for what should be a major Bethesda game. But the fact that it's not made too many waves in the charts, even on like most popular games, console games and PC games on Game Pass, the fact that it's not placing very high here, you can see right here, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th place on consoles, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on PC for specifically Game Pass popularity. All of that tells me that this DLC is not pushing many units, and it's not going to be results that I think it's going to ultimately underwhelm in terms of what they were hoping and expecting this DLC to do for Starfield, in terms of bringing in new players potentially and making some of the money back, additional money back. And so there's just this lack of longevity that other Bethesda games have had. So look at Fallout 4 right now. I mean, it helps that the show that came out on Amazon did cause an influx of players, but that's stabilized. And we're still seeing 24-hour peaks of roughly 20,000-ish players, which is about what you were seeing before the show came out even. So it's not too far off from the norm. And that's close to what we're seeing for Starfield. In fact, it's more than what we're seeing for Starfield as of the recording of this video. Roughly, like 1,500 more players than Starfield. And that's a game that came out many, many years ago that didn't see a new expansion launch for it, and it's got more 24-hour peaks than Starfield. You look at Skyrim right now, that's a game that came out in 2011, and that's got a peak of almost 30,000 players, significantly more than Starfield. People are going back to older Bethesda games, are playing that more than Starfield because those experiences just felt more compelling, and Starfield just didn't hit quite right. It was almost like a deconstructed Bethesda game in the way it split its traditional open world design into exploring planets, but they couldn't give each of those planets the love and attention that they could give one giant cohesive open world. And so that fragmentation and the less compelling experience of that meant that all the flaws that we used to forgive in past Bethesda games just have come out that much more and are much more highlighted and spotlighted. So yeah, I just don't foresee Starfield coming back in the way that Cyberpunk did with Phantom Liberty. I don't foresee Starfield really being a game whose longevity will match the likes of Skyrim and Fallout 4. I think it's safer for Bethesda to just move on from Starfield and focus on Elder Scrolls 6. That's a franchise and an IP that, I mean, is extremely beloved, and that I think, I mean, that's going to sell no matter what because it's fucking Elder Scrolls. But it also, I think it goes back to Bethesda's roots. Elder Scrolls is really Bethesda's bread and butter. But at the same time, there are concerns that with some of their recent outings not being particularly as celebrated as some of their much older games have been, that Bethesda's kind of losing their touch a little bit, or that they're just, again, not keeping up with the times and not keeping up with what other developers have done with open worlds, made them much more compelling and much more technically sound and less janky, and kind of dispense with flaws that Bethesda tends to have in their games, while also making the storytelling and the cohesion of storytelling with gameplay and design and activities and quests and all these things much more compelling. There's also the element of presentation. When you look at games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, the leaps that they've taken in how cinematic these role-playing games feel, on top of all the storytelling and all of the open world elements that they've infused, and it just, Bethesda games presentation looks so stilted and so behind by comparison. Some people, I think, are even concerned about Elder Scrolls 6 and whether that will live up to all of the hype that no doubt will surround it. But I do wish Bethesda the best, and I hope Elder Scrolls is one of the most special video game series for me. I freaking love Elder Scrolls, one of my favorite video game series of all time. And I really want them to do Elder Scrolls 6 justice. I'm more optimistic because it's going back to their roots, and it's not going to be Starfield 2.0. Like, the design of it will be very much Elder Scrolls, obviously with modernizations and evolutions, hopefully, to the gameplay formula. But, it does feel like when I get excited for a Bethesda game, as of late, it's just kind of let me down more than it has like lived up to what I expect from them, or how I see them in terms of as the golden standard for open world games. That's how I used to see them back in the Elder Scrolls, Oblivion, and Skyrim and Fallout days. But lately, it's felt like that image is slipping a little bit, and hopefully they can kind of find ways to catch up and maybe even set new standards like they did long ago for what open world style games like these can achieve, and what role-playing experiences can become, and how those boundaries can be pushed forward instead of sticking to old formulas and design elements and technical issues that make these games start to kind of feel stale or dated even. But we'll see what the future holds. But in the meantime, this is kind of what the situation looks like for Starfield. It's all very like lukewarm across the board, and not what you'd expect from a Bethesda, from a major Bethesda AAA launch. And so I'll be curious to see what this says about the future of Bethesda, and whether they can, make a comeback, make a recovery from what feels like this downwards trend. But let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the state of Starfield, and what you think prospects look like for Bethesda in the future. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.